The Pentagon has acknowledged that classified information has been leaked related to Israel's planned attack against Iran in retaliation for Iran's missile attack on October 1st. Now, headlines all over the world are talking about this leak, but there are three critically important points that mainstream media doesn't fully understand that I want to make sure you understand as it relates to the collection and sharing of intelligence, as well as predicting next steps in the Israeli and Iran conflict. Point number one. The documents appear to have been shared across the Five Eyes intelligence agencies, or a collaboration, a cooperation between 5 Western intelligence services that are known to share critically important information. And those 5 countries, the Five Eyes, are the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These 5 countries have been collecting and collaborating and coordinating intelligence among each other for many, many decades. That's not a secret. That's publicly known information. Now, what's really interesting here is that the threshold to share intelligence across the Five Eyes community isn't something that would usually include something like a U.S. assessment of Israel's attack on Iran, because the Five Eyes community is really there to share intelligence that has to do with imminent threats that could impact any of those 5 countries. But in a conflict between Israel and Iran, none of the Five Eyes countries would be imminently threatened. So what would qualify to make the U.S. share its clandestine assessment of what Israel would do against Iran with countries like Australia and New Zealand? That's the first important point here. This report would generally have never been released to the Five Eyes, let alone leaked because of its release to the Five Eyes. So why was it that this report was released to the Five Eyes community? Now, this is where we move into the second point, because the second important thing to understand here is that the United States has never acknowledged the existence of a nuclear capability in Israel. That's critically important because that means, according to the United States national security doctrine, it would be considered a national security secret, classified top secret information that Israel even had the capacity for nuclear weapons. I was a nuclear missile combat officer with the Air Force. Even I, as a cleared nuclear missile officer in the Air Force, did not have the need to know that Israel was nuclear equipped. That important detail has been classified and kept secret from the American public. However, it's the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service, CSIS, that has made that information public. In fact, it was CSIS that made it public knowledge to the world that Israel had the Jericho 2 nuclear-capable launch system, and also explained the background of that system. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Jericho missile system was actually something that was developed in the 1970s in what, believe it or not, was a joint Israeli-Iranian project that carried through until 1979. And then after 1979, it was actually the South Africans that started working with the Israelis to develop the Jericho 1 platform, which was originally designed to be used for space cargo and space delivery. Now, since the 1980s, after the Israeli-South African cooperation expired, it looks like the Jericho 1 and Jericho 2 systems were adapted and evolved to also carry nuclear missile warheads. The question still remains, where did Israel get its nuclear warhead capability? Knock, knock. It would make a lot of sense if that came from the United States. That said, the Jericho 2 missile system is the one that's currently deployed, with plans for a Jericho 3 system that is on the way. It is that Jericho 2 system that is referenced in these leaked documents. So already we know that in the eyes of the American public, one, this document should have never been shared across the Five Eyes because it doesn't meet threshold for sharing information with our Western intelligence counterparts. And number two, it references a nuclear delivery system that only the Canadians have ever acknowledged. Now, interestingly here, it is the second point that helps us understand the first point. Because the Canadian Secret Intelligence Service is the only service that has ever publicly acknowledged the existence of an Israeli nuclear weapon system, it may very well be that because of the Canadian involvement here, that is why this report was shared with the Five Eyes. So because the Canadians have publicly acknowledged the existence of an Israeli nuclear weapons capability, that may very well be why the United States NGA and NSA were forced to share this report across the Five Eyes. Now, the third point to understand here is that the report that was leaked this week was actually dated from collection on October 15 and October 16, but the leak actually occurred on October 23rd. So what is it that happened in the intermediate 8 days? Why would it take 8 days for an intelligence report to be shared? This is something that speaks to the bureaucracy of intelligence collection and intelligence sharing, and something that you don't ever see in movies or books or television. Intelligence takes time. It takes time to collect, it takes time to analyze, it takes time to vet, and it takes time to distribute. So even though the raw imagery and signals analysis may have been collected on October 15th and 16th, the assessment that was actually written, reviewed, approved, and escalated through the Pentagon would have taken 2 to 3 days. And the time that it would have taken the Pentagon to share that information with foreign governments through the Talent Keyhold program would have taken another 2 to 3 days. So here you can see how time starts to compile. So even the most timely intelligence is still intelligence that is between 5 and 7 days old when it gets distributed. So this report that was being shared across the Five Eyes was dated October 15th, 16th, even though the Five Eyes may not have seen it until October 21st or 22nd. So you really get a sense for the bureaucratic process that goes into intelligence collection. It's not just a matter of find a secret, share a secret, or find a secret and analyze a secret. It really is a multi-step process that takes days at a time. Now, each of these 3 points on their own is interesting, but when you put all 3 points together, you actually start to create what we call a synthesized analysis of the situation. So that means when you consider the fact that this report would not have traditionally been shared across the Five Eyes, and you add to that the fact that only Canada has ever publicly acknowledged the existence of an Israeli nuclear weapons capability, and the fact that it would have taken between 6 and 8 days before the Five Eyes partners were ever informed of this U.S. assessment, you start to see how dangerous the escalation of this Middle East conflict really is through the eyes of Washington, D.C. The current administration obviously considers continued escalation in the Middle East to be a major national security priority, so significant that it's willing to share what information it has about a known ally, like Israel, with other partners like the Five Eyes partners. And it's willing to acknowledge in those reports that there is an active nuclear threat that must be considered. This confirms the majority of messaging that we are seeing in the mainstream media coming from the current administration. They do, in fact, want to see a de-escalation of conflict in the Middle East. Now, do they want to see that de-escalation of conflict because they want to protect Palestinians, or do they want to see that de-escalation because we're so heavily invested with foreign direct investment in Israel? I think it's more likely that we want to see a de-escalation because we're trying to protect our investment. What we are not seeing is that the United States administration is confirming or corroborating any of the genocide or war crime accusations that are coming from the UN. Nevertheless, what this leak does confirm is that the United States does want to share information across its intelligence partnerships to try to de-escalate or prevent unexpected escalation in the conflict between Israel and Iran. Now, there's one more point here that I really want to highlight because I think it's important. No matter how much the United States has tried to de-escalate Netanyahu and de-escalate this conflict ever since October 6th of last year, it has not seemed to make a difference. And even now, when President Biden is telling the public that he is actively engaging Netanyahu to de-escalate this conflict, you see that Israel is continuing to not only ramp up its plans of attack, but it's putting very significant premeditation into those plans to the point where they're planning to use air-launched ballistic missiles that can be launched at a great distance so that Israel doesn't overfly any airspace that might create conflict, airspace that might belong to Jordan or Iraq or even Egypt. You can see that Israel is taking steps to make sure that it can execute its retaliation promise while trying to minimize blowback from Washington, D.C. This speaks to the theories and assessments that the war between Israel and Iran is really Netanyahu's war. It is not something that the Israeli people want. It is not something that benefits the Israeli economy. It is in fact something that Netanyahu is escalating because he understands that if the spotlight falls off of Iran, it's going to fall squarely back on Netanyahu's shoulders. And his previous accusations of fraud and corruption and negligence, not to mention the fact that there are still hostages being held by Hamas, while multiple ceasefire initiatives have been proposed by countries from China to Oman. Make no mistake that the United States' willingness to share secret intelligence collection about Israel with the Five Eyes is a big deal. It speaks not only to how dedicated the United States is to de-escalate the conflict in the Middle East, but it also shows the lack of trust that the United States government has in diplomatic channels working with Netanyahu. Based on this leaked assessment and the previous decisions by Netanyahu in escalating the conflict against Hamas and Hezbollah, it is a high likelihood that Israel will still carry out a retaliatory strike against Iran, and it will still use air-launched ballistic missiles because it knows that Iran's air missile defense system is weaker than its own. Keep in mind, Israel not only has a very sophisticated homegrown missile defense system, it is also getting top-of-the-line brand new technology in missile defense systems, as well as American soldiers to man those systems from the Biden administration being sent to Israel. So we're watching Israel take advantage of its superior military position against Iran. It will launch missiles into Iran that it knows Iran can't defend defend against, because any missiles that come back from Iran to Israel, Israel already understands it has a high probability of shooting those missiles down. We are watching as a ground war with improvised drone technology drags on in Europe, and at the same time we're watching what appears to be a growing missile war advance and evolve in the Middle East. The question is not whether or not Israel will attack Iran. The question is when it will attack Iran, and whether or not the Five Eyes partners collecting intelligence against Israel will do a better job of protecting their classified information in the future. Right now, as it stands, Israel understands that the Five Eyes partners, its closest Western allies, do not trust Netanyahu's administration to tell them the truth. So much so that they are actually dedicating satellite resources from NGA and NSA to collect information against Israel, one of their closest allies. Now, intelligence collection against allies is not a surprise. It's been happening for a long time. It's not often publicly disclosed, but whenever you are in the professional intelligence world, you understand that your friends collect against you. President Barack Obama got caught collecting secrets against the Chancellor of Germany, just like the United States just got caught collecting secrets against Israel. This is something that happens in the professional intelligence world, but what it really speaks to is the lack of diplomatic trust between countries. Keep your eyes on the headlines. It's only a matter of time before we see Israel carry out its retaliatory strike against Iran, and it'll also be interesting to find out whether or not the Pentagon ever publicly acknowledges how this leak happened in the first place. If you want to learn more about how CIA trained me to track and analyze current events, and if you want to start reading the news through the eyes of a spy, go ahead and click on the link in the description below, and I'll see you on the other side.